Constitutional lawyers are still debating the potential for the voice to Parliament to lead to government decisions being regularly challenged in the High Court. The federal government's preferred wording for the proposed constitutional amendment includes the words executive government. Some legal experts believe the High Court could determine that the executive government, which includes public service, could be legally compelled to consider the recommendations from the voice on a range of issues before making a decision on policy, and that could lead to High Court action. But other constitutional experts have rejected that argument.
If you look at the terms of the referendum amendment itself, it says nothing in there about there being any legal obligation to respond to those representations. It's really intended to be, again, a political issue as to whether or not you do. So there's no words in there that would support any implication beyond that, nor is there any intent behind it as well. And the government's made it very clear that this is not intended to be some kind of veto or a legal obligation to take these considerations into account.
Professor Anne Toomey there speaking to us just in the last hour or so, and Emeritus Professor Greg Craven is a constitutional lawyer who joins us now from Sydney. Greg Craven, welcome. So just before we get into the detail of this, is it your hope that some form of Indigenous advisory body to Parliament could be established one day?
Absolutely. I was one of the people who those years ago devised the Indigenous voice, and I have consistently argued for it and will continue to argue for it. This is about constitutional mechanisms, not about whether the voice is a good idea.
OK, so we have the proposed wording now of both the referendum question to be put later this year and the constitutional additions. The constitutional additions include the provision that this Indigenous advisory group, the Voice, may make representations to the Parliament and executive government of the Commonwealth. How do you feel about the executive government being retained there?
Very poorly, because I think the result of that will be that the voice will be able to legally intrude constantly on every possible decision, and there would be every reasonable prospect that that would lead to multiple judicial interventions. And the result of that would be, I think, that government would be seriously and serially compromised.
What do you make of Anne Toomey's argument that it makes it clear that there is not a legal obligation on the executive to take this into account unless Parliament says so, and that will be stipulated later?
Well, Anne Toomey and I are very good friends. With constitutional lawyers, you can get variances of opinions, and I simply disagree with her. The reality is if you say you can legislate about the composition, powers and procedures of the voice, I think on any reasonable analysis that does not include the legal effect of representations by the voice. That's just too fundamental.
And what about the fact that the Parliament shall have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures?
Well, as I said, I don't think you can fit in legal effect to any of the composition, powers and procedures. And I have to say, until very recently, it was clear that both the Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, and the Solicitor-General, Stephen Donoghue, agreed with me because they proposed to insert 7 extra words precisely to say that Parliament could legislate with respect to the legal effect of the representations, and they were defeated in the working group. So it's not a question of me being out here on my own. I have some pretty good friends.
But what about the argument that the slight tweaking of that takes that into account and that the Parliament shall have the power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the voice?
I think the idea that putting the words relating into creates some sort of extraordinary salvation of the voice from this perspective is essentially humorous. It's comic opera. It's hard to imagine that such a vague expression would have such a dramatic effect. And I'm pretty confident that the High Court, which would be nervy of laws regulating the legal effect of representations anyway, would be pretty disinclined to put that much faith in one word.
The Prime Minister has said that the primacy of the Parliament is there. He's just held a media conference and we've heard him saying this, that the primacy of the Parliament is clear to determine the powers of the voice. Do you agree that that is the case with the wording that has been proposed?
Well, he's profoundly and completely wrong. I heard the previous broadcast from you saying what a good constitutional lawyer Anne Toomey is, and I cordially agree. Unfortunately, Anthony Albanese is not a good constitutional lawyer. He's no sort of constitutional lawyer. So his views on the legalities around this referendum and these words are beside the point.
But he's been advised by Anne Toomey, who you say you respect, and so and she's saying effectively the same thing.
Well, that's interesting because I last was in a talk to Anne Toomey about 36 hours ago. And at that point, she rang me to ask me if I knew what was going on because she had had absolutely no involvement or no contact. So unless something dramatic has happened in the very recent past, I find that pretty difficult to take seriously. Again and again, we've been told that great jurists have devised the amendment. Now we're told that great jurists helped come up with this formulation. I mean, the question's got to be which great jurists, because so far we've had none actually specified, except apparently Professor Toomey, who must have been brought in, if at all, very, very late.
Anne Toomey has suggested it's a bit premature to jump to conclusions now because a lot of the detail will be evident in the Constitutional Alteration Bill and explanatory memorandum. Do you expect that will spell things out further and allay your concerns?
No, I think it's a bit rich to say it's a bit early. And what we've actually had is we've now had the Prime Minister and the Cabinet lock in absolutely and emotionally behind these particular words. So the idea that we've got a lot of time is nonsense. All we've got is the parliamentary committee process and the passage through the Parliament. So this is 2 minutes to midnight, to quote the Prime Minister, if not now, when. I know that Anne Toomey has great confidence in the notion of explanatory memoranda. I have less. But if we're so confident that the explanatory memoranda will solve this, why don't we put it beyond doubt by putting it in the words of the Constitution? A normal principle is if there's doubt, remove the doubt. Why has the working group not wanted to do that? And the answer is very simple. The working group wants there to be multiple legal action. They want the High Court to be deeply active in this context, and there is no use pretending anything else.
What's your evidence that the working group wants there to be extensive legal action?
Well, the evidence is there in their own words. If you've been watching the working group talking, and members of the working group, particularly relatively radical ones, like Megan Davis, they have been absolutely defending the notion that there will be regular judicial interventions. It's a good idea. This has to happen, or the voice will be a toothless tiger. There's been a very real move from, oh, well, it might happen, but it's not that much, to this being an integral part of the model. And that's a change. The voice was originally a conservative model designed to preclude judicial activism. At the hands of people like Megan Davis, it has become a vehicle for judicial activism.
But I come back to that Anne Toomey argument that she says there is no legal obligation stipulated in the wording as it is, and that Parliament will have the ultimate say on the powers of the voice.
Well, we've dealt with the Parliament having the final say because, as I said, the words are not wide enough to cover legal effects of representation. So I just don't think the Parliament is going to have its say over. They have its say over compositions and procedures, but not actual powers. But the reality is that you are going to have these judicial interventions simply on ordinary principles of public law, which says if you're meant to listen to representations, if you're meant to at least get them, which clearly is the purpose as described by the Working Party, normal principles would say, well, if the Commonwealth Government somehow or other doesn't allow sufficient time for the voice to make a representation, arguably even if the representation is made and Parliament doesn't have regard to relevant factors, then you can pick up any book on public law and it will tell you that you'll be able to go and get a remedy to make sure that the Parliament does indeed adequately receive the representations. Now, on that basis, then you are going to have constant judicial activism. That is the intention behind Indigenous activists, and it will have the ability to tie every aspect of government power under the Constitution in knots.
Greg Craven, is it fair enough to say that you feel pretty frustrated that this is what this has come to after you've been keen to see some kind of Indigenous voice to Parliament or advisory group to Parliament get up over the years? I'm sensing that you're pretty frustrated that it's come to this.
I'm not pretty frustrated. I'm incredibly frustrated. I think the government has made multiple errors of process here, one of which is a total lack of clarity. So this alteration was designed in a black box. We don't know who designed it. Now it's been revised in a black box. There's been no attempt to engage wider opinion. And I think the total disaster is we've already got a referendum that's heading south in the polls. Even before this, it was describing the typical arc of a losing referendum. Now with this, I think firstly you're going to have a bad proposal, and that's going to be even worse for the referendum. But the most potent argument surely for the no side will be even your own Attorney General and your own Solicitor General said this proposal should not go forward, in the words of executive government, and now you're trying to sell us that. I mean, if the no case needed another argument, it's got an absolute humdinger.
And Toomey makes the point that with the tweaked wording of that third part of the second part of the Constitution, second or third part, that the make laws with respect to encompasses what the attorney was proposing anyway. But just back to your point that you said before, words to the effect of respected people are saying respected jurists have come up with this. And it sounds like you're saying the respected jurists have been bypassed on this. But I was just interviewing Anne Toomey in the last hour, and she's very supportive of this proposal as it stands, and is very comfortable with it. So, and you've said she's you respect her. So she's at least one respected jurist who has been heavily involved in this and is comfortable with the wording as it is.
Well, Anne and I have both been heavily involved through the Constitutional Experts Group, but as I said to you, there's a difference between supporting something and actually having been involved in it. Now, as far as I know, from Anne, as recently as 36 hours ago, she had no involvement in the Constitutional Experts Group. The Constitutional Expert Group hasn't met for 3 weeks, so it's provided no advice to the working group. Now, they may have, hot and cold, running constitutional advisors, but as of 36 hours ago, certainly wasn't Anne, certainly wasn't me, and I have no idea who they were. Now, I would invite the government to say who these advisors are, and as I say, not just to refer to Professor Toomey, because clearly she wasn't in there from the outset. And in the absence of knowing who those people are, not only is it impossible to rebut them, but it's pretty well impossible to believe the position that there was such extensive constitutional advice, particularly when the last, if you like, public advice was from the Attorney General and the Solicitor General, who said the idea of executive government was clearly flawed.
And what do you make of the opposition's call for the Solicitor General's advice to be released publicly?
Look, I'm sort of dubious that it's relevant because it's assuming that there's written advice. There's not always written advice in these things. It may be that the Solicitor General's advice was oral advice only. If there was written advice, yes, I think it would be a good idea to clarify things by putting it out. I think, yes, that would be absolutely the case. I think, yes, Dutton would be right on that. But, if it's no written advice, there's nothing to disclose.
Okay, Greg Craven, thank you very much for talking to us this morning here on the News Channel.
Thank you.